Deep beneath the ancient vaults of the Vatican, behind massive doors with triple locks, lies one of the world's most mysterious financial empires. The Institute for Religious Works, known as the Vatican Bank, has been shrouded in secrets for 80 years that have shaken the foundations of international finance. Links to the Mafia, laundering billions, mysterious deaths, and secret operations. Behind the religious facade lay a machine capable of influencing the fate of states and corporations around the world. Subscribe to our channel to learn the truth about the secret mechanisms that control our world. And in the comments, discuss. Do you think Pope Francis's radical reforms have finally cleansed the Vatican Bank of its criminal past? Or do dark connections continue to exist in the shadows? Share your opinion. In the heart of Rome, behind the high walls of the Vatican, lies one of the most mysterious financial institutions in the world. The Institute for Religious Works, known as the Vatican Bank, has remained a secretive organization for decades, whose operations have influenced the fate of states and corporations around the world. The history of this unique bank began in 1942, when Pope Pius XII signed an apostolic letter establishing the Institute for Religious Works. Officially, its purpose was to manage funds intended for religious and charitable activities, but the reality turned out to be much more complex and darker. From the moment of its creation, the bank was granted a unique status. As a financial institution of a sovereign state, it was outside the jurisdiction of Italian and international regulators. This feature became its main advantage and, at the same time, a source of future problems. The first president of the institution was Bernardino Nogara, a financial genius who laid the foundations for what would later be called the most secretive bank in the world. Nogara understood that absolute secrecy was necessary for the effective management of Vatican assets. He created a complex network of offshore companies and banks that allowed transactions to be carried out away from prying eyes. During World War II, the Vatican Bank faced particular challenges. It was necessary to preserve and increase the Church's assets in the context of global conflict. It was then that the foundations were laid for the system of financial transactions that would later lead to numerous scandals. Nogara developed a sophisticated investment scheme, taking advantage of the Vatican's neutral status. The Church invested in the military industries of all the warring parties, making a profit regardless of the outcome of the war. These transactions were carried out through front companies and intermediary banks, making them virtually impossible to trace. After the war ended, the bank faced a new challenge: legalizing its accumulated funds and integrating them into the post-war financial system. It was then that the first ties were established with Italian financiers, some of whom had dubious reputations. The uniqueness of the Vatican Bank lay not only in its status, but also in its special management structure. The institution was headed by a president, but the real power was held by 5 cardinals who reported directly to the Pope and the Vatican Secretary of State. This system ensured maximum secrecy, but at the same time created opportunities for abuse. By the end of the 1940s, the Vatican Bank had become a powerful financial institution with assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Only the highest church hierarchs, Vatican officials, and diplomats accredited to the Holy See could become its clients. But in practice, the admission system turned out to be much more flexible. The Iron Curtain of secrecy surrounding the institution's activities attracted the attention not only of church officials, but also of representatives of the Italian elite who sought to hide their funds from the tax authorities. Thus began the transformation of the bank from a religious institution into a tax haven for wealthy Italians. Its geographical location played a special role in the development of the institution. Located in the very center of Rome, the bank was physically inaccessible to the Italian authorities, but at the same time could easily interact with the Italian financial system. This unique position became the basis for future machinations. The first suspicions of the bank's shady dealings arose as early as the 1950s, when Italian journalists began asking uncomfortable questions about the Vatican's sources of income and the nature of its investments. But the Church successfully fended off criticism by citing its sovereign status and religious mission. By the early 1960s, the Vatican Bank was already firmly established in the international financial system, having created a network of connections with the world's largest banks. But it was these connections that subsequently drew it into a series of scandals that shook not only the Catholic Church, but also the international financial community. The 1950s and 1960s were a period when the Vatican Bank began to attract the attention of some very special clients. Behind the facade of religious piety lay a reality that would have shocked ordinary Catholics. The institution was establishing relations with representatives of organized crime. The first ties with the Mafia were established almost by accident. Italian crime bosses had long been looking for ways to legalize their income and hide it from the authorities. The Vatican Bank, with its absolute secrecy and immunity, seemed the ideal solution to this problem. Michele Sindona, a Sicilian banker whom the press would later call God's banker, played a key role in establishing these ties. Sindona was a controversial figure. On the one hand, he presented himself as a devout Catholic and generous donor to the Church, while on the other, he had close ties to the Sicilian Mafia. In 1954, Sindona met with representatives of the Vatican's financial administration for the first time. He offered his services as a financial advisor and investment broker. The Sicilian's charm and professionalism made a strong impression on Vatican officials. Sindona possessed unique qualities for working with the Vatican Bank. He was well-versed in Italian banking law, had connections in government circles, and, most importantly, could guarantee absolute discretion in his operations. His clients included not only respectable businessmen, but also representatives of various criminal groups. The first joint operations between Sindona and the Vatican Bank involved investments in Italian real estate and industry. Formally, everything looked completely legal. The Church was investing funds in the development of the economy of a Catholic country. But the sources of these funds were often highly questionable. Relations between Sindona and Archbishop Paul Markinicus, an American of Lithuanian origin who became head of the Vatican Bank in 1962, developed particularly actively. Markinicus was a practical man who was not very interested in the subtleties of the origin of the funds with which the bank worked. Under Markinicus's leadership, the Institute for Religious Works began to engage in increasingly risky operations. The bank issued loans secured by dubious assets, participated in speculative currency transactions, and invested in companies with unclear reputations. The profits from these operations were enormous, which made them particularly attractive. Simultaneously with the development of relations with Sindona, the Vatican Bank began to attract other dubious clients. Among them were well-known mafiosi, who used the bank to launder money obtained from drug trafficking, racketeering, and other crimes. Accounts were opened in the names of front men or under the guise of charitable organizations. The system was thought out down to the smallest detail. Criminal groups, through their representatives in the church hierarchy, received recommendations to open accounts at the Vatican Bank. The funds came in small amounts through various channels, which made them difficult to trace. The money was then invested in legal businesses or transferred to other banks. Fake charitable organizations played a special role in these schemes. Mafia groups created fictitious religious societies and orders that were formally engaged in charity work but actually served as a cover for laundering criminal proceeds. The Vatican Bank willingly served such organizations without conducting a thorough check of their activities. By the end of the 1960s, the Vatican Bank had effectively become the central link in the largest money laundering scheme in post-war Europe. Hundreds of millions of dollars of dubious origin passed through its accounts. These funds were then invested in the legal economy, allowing criminal groups to integrate into respectable businesses. Italian law enforcement agencies began to suspect something was amiss in the mid-1960s, but their ability to investigate the Vatican Bank's activities was extremely limited. The Vatican's sovereign status made it virtually immune to Italian justice. The first serious suspicions arose after a series of major financial frauds involving clients of the Vatican Bank. The Italian financial police noticed unusually active movement of funds between various banks and countries involving Vatican structures. However, all attempts to obtain information about the bank's clients and operations were met with a wall of secrecy. The Vatican authorities categorically refused to provide any information, citing banking secrecy and the religious nature of the institution. This position only reinforced the suspicions of law enforcement agencies. By the early 1970s, the situation had become critical. The Vatican Bank's links to organized crime were no longer a secret to those in the know, but it was virtually impossible to prove anything concrete. The Institute for Religious Works continued to function as usual, serving an increasingly dubious clientele and conducting increasingly risky operations. In 1965, a man whose name would forever be associated with financial scandals entered the Vatican Bank's life. Roberto Calvi, a Milanese banker whom the press would dub God's banker, would become the central figure in the most high-profile case involving the Institute for Religious Works. Calvi was born in Milan in 1920 into a middle-class family. After receiving an education in economics, he began his career in banking, quickly climbing the corporate ladder thanks to his extraordinary abilities and ambition. By the early 1960s, he already held a high position at Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks. Banco Ambrosiano was founded in 1896 by a group of Catholic financiers and was originally positioned as a bank serving the interests of the Catholic Church and devout laypeople. Its name came from Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan, which emphasized the religious orientation of the institution. Calvi became chairman of Banco Ambrosiano in 1971, and it was from this moment that his rapprochement with the Vatican Bank began. Initially, the cooperation developed within the framework of traditional banking operations, loans, investments, and currency transactions. But gradually, it took on a completely different character. Michele Sindona played a key role in establishing relations between Calvi and the Vatican. It was he who introduced the Milanese banker to Archbishop Marcinkus, presenting him as a talented financier capable of significantly increasing the church's income. Sindona acted as a kind of mediator and guarantor in these relations. The first joint operations between Calvi and the Vatican Bank involved investments in Latin American companies. Formally, the Vatican Bank acted as a guarantor for loans that Banco Ambrosiano provided to various enterprises in Argentina, Brazil, and other countries in the region. In reality, these operations were a complex scheme for withdrawing funds from Italy. The scheme worked as follows. Banco Ambrosiano created subsidiaries in offshore zones that were formally independent of the parent bank. These companies received loans from the Italian bank under the guarantee of the Vatican Bank. The funds were then invested in various projects, often fictitious, and the profits were accumulated in accounts in banks in countries with banking secrecy. Banks in Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Panama were particularly actively used. In these jurisdictions, Calvi created a whole network of banks and financial companies that were not formally affiliated with Banco Ambrosiano, but were in fact controlled by it. The Vatican Bank ensured the legitimacy of these operations by acting as a religious organization interested in the development of Catholic countries. By the mid-1970s, the volume of joint operations between Calvi and the Vatican Bank was estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. Banco Ambrosiano became the largest partner of the Institute for Religious Works, and Calvi himself became one of the most influential bankers in Italy. His connections in government circles and the financial world seemed unlimited, but behind the outward success lay serious problems. Many of Calvi's investments were extremely risky, and some projects turned out to be outright failures. To cover his losses, the banker was forced to resort to increasingly dubious operations, including outright fraud and the creation of fictitious assets. Investments in real estate and industrial enterprises in Latin America proved particularly problematic. Many of these projects existed only on paper, but were backed by huge loans. When creditors began to demand repayment, it became clear that there were simply no real assets to cover them. Calvi tried to solve the problems by attracting new loans and investors. He used his influence and connections with the Vatican Bank to obtain additional financing. Archbishop Marcinicus, without going into the details of the financial transactions, continued to provide guarantees for new loans. By the end of the 1970s, Banco Ambrosiano's financial situation had become critical. The bank was effectively bankrupt, but this was carefully concealed from the public and regulatory authorities. Calvi used a complex system of offsetting and cross-guarantees to create the appearance of financial stability. The situation was complicated by the arrest of Michel Sindona in 1980 on charges of fraud and links to the Mafia. The investigation into his case began to reveal the extent of corruption in the Italian banking system. The names of Calvi and the Vatican Bank appeared more and more frequently in the investigation materials. The Italian Central Bank began auditing Banco Ambrosiano in the late 1970s. Inspectors found numerous violations and questionable transactions, but the full extent of the problems had yet to be determined. Calvi tried with all his might to hide the true state of affairs, hoping to find a way out of the crisis. The pressure on the God's banker grew stronger every day. On the one hand, the Italian authorities demanded explanations for his bank's dubious transactions. On the other hand, creditors and partners began to suspect something was wrong and demanded guarantees that their investments would be returned. Calvi found himself at the center of a huge financial scandal that was about to erupt. In the spring of 1982, the situation reached a critical point. Banco Ambrosiano was unable to meet its obligations on a number of large loans, and its financial problems became public knowledge. A process began that would lead to the collapse of one of Italy's largest banks and one of the most mysterious deaths in the history of international finance. On the morning of June 18, 1982, the body of a man was found hanging from a rope under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Thousands of dollars in cash, a fake passport, and several bricks for weight were found in the deceased's pockets. The man turned out to be Roberto Calvi, God's banker, whose death became one of the most mysterious pages in the history of international finance. A few days before the tragic events in London, Calvi's financial empire finally collapsed. On June 17th, Banco Ambrosiano was declared bankrupt with debts of $1.5 billion, an astronomical sum for that time. It was the largest bank failure in Italy's post-war history. The investigation into the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano revealed the scale of financial fraud that shocked even experienced investigators. It turned out that the bank was in fact an empty shell, and its assets existed only on paper. Most of the funds were transferred through a network of offshore companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and Nicaragua. The Vatican Bank played a key role in these schemes, acting as a guarantor for a number of dubious transactions. The investigation uncovered correspondence between Calvi and Archbishop Marquinhos, which showed that the highest church hierarchs were aware of the nature of the transactions. The case of Ambrosiano Holding, the Luxembourg subsidiary of an Italian bank, proved particularly scandalous. This company owned controlling stakes in a number of enterprises in Latin America, but on closer inspection, it turned out that most of these assets were fictitious. The real value of the company was only a small fraction of its stated value. Even more complex was the structure of the Panamanian companies associated with the Vatican Bank. These firms formally belonged to the Institute for Religious Works, but were actually managed by Calvi's people. Hundreds of millions of dollars passed through these companies, the sources of which remained unclear even after years of investigation. Calvi understood that collapse was inevitable long before the official announcement of bankruptcy. In May 1982, he was arrested by Italian police on charges of illegal capital export, but was soon released on bail. The banker knew that this was only the beginning and that the authorities would soon bring much more serious charges against him. On the eve of the bank's collapse, Calvi left Italy on forged documents. He hoped to find refuge in one of the countries where his offshore assets were located and tried to negotiate a debt restructuring with his creditors. However, the situation turned out to be much more dangerous than he had anticipated. According to investigators, Calvi had ties not only to the Vatican Bank, but also to Italian far-right organizations and South American drug cartels. Some of the funds passing through his bank allegedly belonged to Mafia groups and were obtained from drug trafficking. The collapse of the bank meant the loss of this money, which made Calvi's position extremely dangerous. The circumstances surrounding the death of God's banker remain a subject of controversy. British police initially classified the incident as a suicide, but many details did not fit this version. The presence of bricks in his pockets, the choice of location for the suicide, and the condition of the body all pointed to murder. Years later, the Italian courts recognized Calvi's death as murder. According to the investigation, the banker was eliminated on the orders of Mafia groups that had lost significant sums of money due to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. The perpetrators could have been Italian mafiosi or mercenaries from other countries. It is symbolic that the body was found under Blackfriars Bridge. This bridge was traditionally associated with the Propaganda II Masonic Lodge, which included many influential Italian politicians and businessmen. Calvi himself was a member of this organization, which added a mystical touch to his death. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano put the Vatican Bank in an extremely difficult position. As the guarantor of many of the bankrupt bank's operations, the Institute for Religious Works was formally responsible for the huge debts. Creditors demanded compensation from the Vatican, citing letters of guarantee signed by Archbishop Marquinhos. The Vatican authorities took an ambivalent position. On the one hand, they denied any responsibility for Calvi's machinations, claiming that they had been misled about the true nature of his operations. On the other hand, the Church could not completely distance itself from the scandal, as documents testified to close cooperation. The international financial community demanded that the Vatican fully disclose information about its dealings with Banco Ambrosiano. Italian authorities issued an arrest warrant for Archbishop Marcinicus, but he invoked diplomatic immunity and refused to leave Vatican territory. In 1984, after lengthy negotiations, the Vatican agreed to pay $244 million as a voluntary contribution to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors. Officially, this was not recognized as compensation for damages, but was considered a gesture of goodwill on the part of the Church. However, the payment of this amount did not resolve all questions about the Vatican Bank. The investigation continued to uncover new facts about the cooperation between the Institute for Religious Works and the bankrupt Italian bank. Many documents remained classified, which only reinforced suspicions of an attempt to hide the true extent of the scandal. The Banco Ambrosiano case was a turning point in the history of the Vatican Bank. For the first time, the activities of this closed institution were subjected to such close international scrutiny. The scandal showed that even the most powerful religious institutions cannot remain immune to the consequences of financial fraud and links to criminal structures. Archbishop Paul Marcinicus, an American of Lithuanian descent, had become a symbol of how a religious institution could operate like a risky investment fund by the early 1980s. Tall, energetic, with the strong voice of a professional preacher, he viewed the management of church funds as a sacred mission. He signed millions in guarantees that gave the Vatican Bank access to transactions around the world. Marcinicus believed that the more profit, the more opportunities for evangelization. However, it was precisely this uncompromising conviction that became his Achilles heel. After the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, the Italian prosecutor's office demanded explanations, and the U.S. Banking Supervision Committee demanded disclosure of correspondent accounts. The response was silence and a reference to diplomatic immunity. Within the walls of the Holy See, the cardinals were divided. Some believed that the archbishop was saving church assets during a difficult period. Others saw him as a gambler who had put the reputation of the papacy at stake. In March 1984, a special commission published a report on 49 accounts with undefined beneficiaries. Among the owners were companies registered in the Bahamas, Liechtenstein, and Panama. The deposits exceeded $300 million, but the purpose of the funds was defined only by the words opera religiosa, religious affairs. The pressure culminated in a demand by Italian courts to lift immunity. In response, the Swiss Guard doubled the number of guards at Marcinicus's residence, and Pope John Paul II asked the press not to confuse the mistakes of individuals with the sins of the Church. In June of that year, the Vatican transferred $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors in the spirit of Christian solidarity, without acknowledging legal responsibility. For the Archbishop, this gesture meant his actual resignation. He left his post as president of the Vatican Bank in February 1990, quietly moved to Arizona, and lived there until the end of his days, regularly responding to letters from former employees with one phrase, "Fiat voluntas tua," "Thy will be done." His era was over, but the risky investment mechanisms he had created continued to operate. like an inertial flywheel that had gained dangerous speed. The dark 1990s were a turning point for the Vatican Bank. After the painful scandals of the 1980s, the institution had to either change radically or finally turn into a financial haven for dubious operations. Unfortunately, the second path was chosen. The new management, headed by Angelo Callia, an Italian banker with an impeccable reputation, was tasked with restoring the confidence of the international financial community. But in practice, this meant creating even more sophisticated schemes to conceal the origin of funds. In 1991, changes were made to the bank's charter that formally strengthened controls but actually expanded the possibilities for conducting transactions without disclosure. The new rules allowed corporate accounts to be opened without specifying the ultimate beneficiaries if the client provided a recommendation from a high-ranking church hierarch or diplomatic mission to the Holy See. This loophole was particularly actively exploited by Italian politicians and businessmen. During Operation Clean Hands, when the Milan prosecutor's office was investigating corruption schemes in the highest echelons of power, the Vatican Bank became a refuge for funds whose origin raised questions for the Italian judiciary. Millions of dollars from representatives of Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party and other political organizations passed through the institution. The transit operations system was a revolutionary innovation. A client could deposit funds into an account at the Vatican Bank and, a few days later, withdraw them in another country through partner banks. At the same time, the documents only indicated the movement of funds for church needs, which made it virtually impossible to track the real purposes of the operation. Connections with banks in Switzerland and Liechtenstein played a special role in the development of this system. In 1993, a memorandum of understanding was signed with Credit Suisse, which allowed Vatican Bank customers to transfer funds to Swiss accounts without revealing their identity as part of religious activities. Similar agreements were reached with banks in Austria and Luxembourg. During these years, there was widespread talk for the first time about Ustaša gold, funds allegedly transferred to the Vatican Bank by Croatian collaborators at the end of World War II. American Jewish organizations filed a class action lawsuit demanding the return of valuables looted by the Nazis. The investigation revealed the existence of documents in the bank's archives about the receipt of significant sums from Croatian Catholic organizations between 1944 and 1946. The Vatican authorities categorically denied any connection with Nazi gold, claiming that the funds were donations from believers for the restoration of churches destroyed during the war. However, independent historians discovered documents proving that some of the funds came from individuals who were later accused of war crimes. By the mid-1990s, the Vatican Bank had effectively become Europe's largest tax haven. Its services were used not only by wealthy Catholics, but also by representatives of other faiths, as well as people who were far from religion, but interested in hiding their income from the tax authorities of their countries. Real estate transactions became particularly popular. The bank created a special division that purchased luxury real estate in major cities around the world on behalf of church organizations and then leased or resold it, directing the proceeds to the accounts of the real owners. In this way, it was possible to legalize significant sums of money whose origin was questionable. International pressure intensified after a series of publications in the American press about the bank's links to organized crime. Particular attention was drawn to the case of the Calvo family from Calabria, one of the most influential Mafia clans in Italy. The investigation established that significant sums from drug trafficking were laundered through accounts at the Vatican Bank, under the guise of donations for the construction of parish churches. In 1997, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation launched an operation to track financial flows between American Mafia families and European banks. During wiretaps of conversations between organized crime leaders, the Bank of the Pope was repeatedly mentioned as the safest place to store criminal proceeds. The situation worsened when information leaked to the press that the Vatican Bank was servicing accounts belonging to Latin American drug cartels. According to Colombian law enforcement agencies, funds from cocaine trafficking passed through the institution and were then invested in legal businesses in Europe and North America. The scandal reached its peak when accounts linked to Slobodan Milosevic's regime in Yugoslavia came to light. During the Balkan Wars, the Vatican Bank allegedly facilitated arms purchases in circumvention of international sanctions. Although officials categorically denied these allegations, documents obtained by the International Tribunal contained references to financial transactions through religious organizations in the Vatican. By the end of the 1990s, the Vatican Bank's reputation had been seriously undermined. International rating agencies included the institution in the list of high-risk financial organizations, and a number of large banks terminated their correspondent relations with the Vatican institution. It became clear that without radical reforms, the bank risked complete international isolation. On September 3, 2009, events unfolded rapidly. The Roman Financial Guard blocked 23 million euros in the Vatican Bank's correspondent account at Credito Artigiano. The official justification sounded mundane: violation of Know Your Customer procedures and anti-money laundering legislation. But for the international financial community, this was a signal that the closed structure was once again under scrutiny. The backstory began much earlier. Back in 2007, the Italian Financial Intelligence Unit recorded unusual activity in accounts linked to the Vatican. Large sums were received in short transfers from different countries, then consolidated and withdrawn in a single transaction to offshore jurisdictions. The pattern was classic for money laundering operations: fragmentation, layering, integration. The key figure in the investigation was Ettore Gotti Tedeschi, appointed president of the Vatican Bank in September 2009. Paradoxically, it was the very person who was supposed to carry out the reforms who found himself at the center of the scandal. Gotti Tedeschi was known as a proponent of transparency in banking and the author of works on financial ethics. His appointment was seen as a sign of the Vatican's readiness for change. However, the reality turned out to be more complicated. Gotti Tedeschi discovered a system of operations in the bank that had been developing for decades. Thousands of accounts without clearly identified beneficiaries, transfers through chains of shell companies, investments in funds registered in jurisdictions with banking secrecy. In his own words, some things in the Vatican frightened him. The investigation focused particularly on transactions involving companies registered on the Isle of Man. This British dependent territory was renowned for its liberal financial regulations and the possibility of setting up companies with a nominal capital of £1. Through such structures, the Vatican Bank conducted transactions worth hundreds of millions of euros. The scheme worked as follows. A client of the Vatican Bank would set up a company on the Isle of Man with a nominal share capital, and then this company would receive an investment loan from the Vatican institution. The funds were used to purchase securities or real estate, and the profits were accumulated in accounts in Swiss or Liechtenstein banks. At the same time, the real owner of the capital remained in the shadows. Italian investigators established a link between these transactions and the activities of organized criminal groups. They were particularly interested in transfers linked to the Casallo family from Sicily and the 'Ndrangheta clan from Calabria. The sums involved amounted to tens of millions of euros, and their sources remained unclear. The Vatican Bank took a defensive stance, refusing to provide detailed information about the controversial transactions. The official position was that the institution was acting within the framework of international law and was not violating Italian law, as it is a structure of a sovereign state. The situation escalated sharply when, in December 2009, the newspaper La Repubblica published intercepted correspondence between bank employees. One email referred to the urgent need to transfer the portfolio to a safe haven before the end of the quarter. Another discussed ways to minimize the risks from increased regulatory scrutiny. The publication of these documents sparked a wave of criticism in the international press. Financial experts pointed out that the correspondence indicated a deliberate concealment of information from the supervisory authorities. Vatican authorities declared the publication to be the result of a malicious leak and launched an internal investigation. Pressure from international regulators intensified after the European Committee on Money Laundering, MoneyVal, included the Vatican in its gray list of high-risk jurisdictions. This decision threatened to isolate the bank from the international financial system, as many banks refused to work with institutions from gray list countries. In response to growing criticism, Pope Benedict XVI issued the apostolic letter Motu Proprio on the prevention and combating of illegal financial activities. This document established the Holy See's Financial Information Service, a body responsible for monitoring suspicious transactions and liaising with international regulators. However, the creation of the new structure did not resolve internal contradictions. Gotti Tedeschi insisted on complete transparency and cooperation with the Italian authorities, while the Vatican Secretariat of State feared losing control over the internal affairs of the Church. The conflict reached its peak in May 2012, when the Supervisory Board unanimously dismissed the reformer. After Gotti Tedeschi's departure, the bank was headed by Ernst von Freiberg, a German aristocrat and financier with a reputation as a conservative. His appointment was seen as a signal that radical reforms had been suspended. However, the processes set in motion by the scandal of 2009 could no longer be stopped. By the end of 2012, the Financial Intelligence Unit had frozen more than 700 accounts, recognizing them as suspicious. The total amount of blocked funds exceeded 180 million euros. Many of the bank's clients, fearing further inspections, began to withdraw their assets, which led to a significant reduction in the institution's deposit base. The scandal of 2009 was a turning point in the history of the Vatican Bank. For the first time, the international community received detailed information about the mechanisms of the world's most secretive financial institution. It became clear that without radical changes, the bank would not be able to maintain its position in the global financial system. On a quiet June morning in 2013, a phone call rang at the residence on Gianicolo Street that changed the life of one of the most influential prelates in the Vatican. Monsignor Nunzio Scarano, head of the accounting office of the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, learned that the Italian prosecutor's office was preparing an arrest warrant against him. The man whom the press dubbed Monsignor Cinquecento for his particular fondness for 500 euro notes was accused of creating an international money laundering scheme. Scarano was born in 1951 in the small town of Salerno to a devout Catholic family. After graduating from seminary, he began his career in the Vatican Curia, specializing in financial matters. His aptitude for numbers and commercial activities quickly attracted the attention of his superiors. By the end of the 1980s, he already held senior positions in the financial administration of the Holy See. The first suspicions about Scarano arose in 2012, when the Italian Financial Intelligence Service recorded unusual activity in his personal bank accounts. The Monsignor regularly withdrew large sums of cash that significantly exceeded his official income. At the same time, he did not hide his wealth, appearing in public in expensive suits and driving luxury cars. A detailed investigation revealed a complex scheme of financial fraud, at the center of which was Scarano himself. The Monsignor used his official position to access funds from various Vatican foundations and organizations. He was particularly active with the St. Peter's Pence Fund, a traditional collection of donations from Catholics around the world for the needs of the Pope and the Holy See. The scheme worked as follows. Scarano transferred funds from the St. Peter's Pence Fund to a specially created investment pool, formerly intended to finance social projects of the Church. This pool purchased short-term Italian government bonds with high yields. The bonds were then resold at a significant discount to shell companies controlled by Scarano or his proxies. The margin from these transactions was withdrawn in cash through a network of exchange offices in Rome and Naples. Scarano personally collected the money in suitcases, using an official car with Vatican license plates. According to investigators' estimates, more than 50 million euros was withdrawn in this way over several years. The scheme involving charitable organizations was particularly cynical. Scarano created several fictitious religious societies that were formally engaged in helping refugees and the poor. These organizations received large grants from Vatican structures, but the money was not used for the stated purposes, but for the personal needs of the Monsignor and his accomplices. The culmination of Scarano's activities was an attempt to carry out a large-scale operation to import 20 million euros from Switzerland. To this end, he enlisted the help of Giovanni Carlucci, an adventurer with a dubious reputation and a former Italian Secret Service officer. The plan involved using a private plane and diplomatic mail to deliver the cash to Rome. However, the Italian authorities were tipped off about the operation by an informant from Scarano's circle. On June 28, 2013, the Monsignor was arrested at his residence. During a search, investigators found large sums of cash in various currencies, expensive works of art, and documents confirming complex financial schemes. Scarano's arrest had the effect of a bombshell in Vatican circles. It was the first time a high-ranking prelate had been arrested on charges of financial crimes on such a large scale. This was a serious blow to the reputation of the Holy See, especially in the first months of Pope Francis's pontificate, who had promised a poor church for the poor. The new pope reacted decisively. Just a week after Scarano's arrest, a special commission was set up to investigate financial irregularities in Vatican structures. The commission was headed by Cardinal Raphael Farina, known for his principled views on matters of church discipline. At the same time, a large-scale audit of all accounts and transactions of the Vatican Bank began. Over the course of a year, more than 6,000 accounts were closed, whose owners were unable to document the legality of the origin of the funds or the purpose of their use. This great purge affected many influential clients of the institution, including representatives of the Italian political elite. Particular attention was paid to cash transactions. The new rules limited the maximum amount of cash transactions to €3,000 and introduced mandatory reporting for all transactions over €1,000. These measures effectively put an end to the practice of withdrawing large amounts of cash, which had flourished at the bank for decades. In June 2014, the International Committee Moneyval recognized the Vatican's efforts to combat money laundering as substantial and credible. The Holy See was removed from the gray list of high-risk jurisdictions. The newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, ran the headline, "Light Through Stained Glass Windows," symbolizing a new era of transparency. Scarano himself was sentenced to 3 years probation and a large fine. He was banned from holding any position in Vatican structures. The Monsignor accepted the court's decision without appeal, publicly repented for his actions, and retired to a monastery for spiritual purification. The Scarano case became a catalyst for profound reforms in the Vatican's financial system. It showed that even the most powerful church hierarchs cannot feel immune if they break the law. At the same time, the scandal demonstrated the new papal leadership's willingness to make radical changes in church finances. However, the reform process was far from complete. Ahead lay new scandals involving Cardinal Becciu and questionable investments in London real estate, as well as attempts to integrate the Vatican Bank into the European SEPA payment system and the struggle with the challenges of the cryptocurrency era. On May 25, 2012, the world learned of the largest leak of secret documents in the history of the Vatican. 4,000 confidential papers fell into the hands of Italian journalist Gianluigi Nuzzi and became the basis for the book Your Holiness, which shook the foundations of the Catholic Church. The scandal was dubbed Vatileaks, by analogy with WikiLeaks, and its consequences are still being felt today. At the center of the scandal was Paolo Gabriele, Pope Benedict XVI's personal valet. This modest employee, who had access to the papal apartments and the pontiff's personal correspondence, systematically copied secret documents over several years. According to his own testimony, he acted out of a conviction that the public should know the truth about corruption in the Vatican. The leak of documents exposed deep divisions in the upper echelons of Vatican power. Letters and notes concerning the financial activities of the Vatican Bank proved particularly compromising. The documents contained direct references to the concealment of information from Italian regulators, the falsification of accounts, and the use of church funds for personal gain by high-ranking prelates. One of the most scandalous documents was a letter from Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, then Secretary General of the Governorate of Vatican City State, addressed to Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, the State Secretary. In the letter, Vigano complained about lobbying groups within the Vatican that were obstructing financial reforms and protecting the interests of dubious bank clients. Particular attention was drawn to documents relating to the activities of Ettore Gotti Tedeschi during his tenure as president of the Vatican Bank. Gotti Tedeschi's personal notes and correspondence contained harsh assessments of the Holy See's financial system. "What I have seen in the Vatican frightens me," he wrote in one of his letters. "There are forces at work here that are not interested in transparency and are willing to do anything to preserve the status quo." The documents also revealed details of the struggle between reformists and conservative circles in the Vatican Curia. Gotti Tedeschi insisted on full cooperation with international regulators and disclosure of information about questionable accounts. His opponents, led by Secretary of State Bertone, considered this approach a threat to the sovereignty of the Vatican and the independence of the Church. The Vatileaks scandal coincided with a period of serious crisis of confidence in the Vatican Bank. International regulators demanded complete transparency of operations. Italian prosecutors investigated cases of money laundering, and the Catholic community was shocked by the scale of corruption in the highest circles of the Church. The leak of documents also revealed a complex network of personal and financial interests within the Vatican. Some high-ranking prelates had close ties to Italian politicians and businessmen, which created a conflict of interest when making decisions about the Church's financial policy. The documents mentioned regular meetings between representatives of the Vatican elite and major Italian industrialists and bankers. Particularly damaging to the Holy See's reputation was the disclosure of information about the luxurious lifestyles of some cardinals and senior prelates. The documents contained bills for expensive restaurants, exclusive hotels, and luxury items paid for with church funds. This stood in stark contrast to the Gospel's calls for simplicity and service to the poor. The Vatican authorities' response to the leak was both harsh and contradictory. On the one hand, criminal proceedings were initiated against Gabriele, who was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison, later pardoned by the Pope. On the other hand, some of the facts revealed in the documents served as the basis for disciplinary measures against corrupt officials. The scandal seriously influenced Pope Benedict XVI's decision to abdicate in February 2013. Although the pontiff officially cited advanced age and declining health, many Vatican insiders believe that Vatileaks played a decisive role in his decision to leave the papal throne. The election of Pope Francis in March 2013 was seen as a direct response to the crisis caused by the leak of documents. From the very first days of his pontificate, the new pontiff made it clear that he intended to carry out radical reforms in the financial sphere and eradicate corruption in the Vatican structures. One of Pope Francis's first decisions was to create a special commission to reform the economic and administrative structure of the Holy See. The commission was headed by authoritative experts in banking and financial law who were not connected to the former Vatican system. Vatileaks also led to a significant tightening of secrecy in the Vatican. New procedures for handling confidential documents were introduced, and control over personnel with access to secret information was strengthened. At the same time, an internal reporting system was created, allowing employees to anonymously report violations without fear of persecution. The long-term consequences of the scandal go far beyond the financial sphere. Vatileaks demonstrated the fragility of the traditional system of governance of the Catholic Church and the need for it to adapt to the demands of the modern world. The scandal also showed the growing role of the media and public opinion in monitoring the activities of religious institutions. By the end of 2013, most of the high-ranking officials mentioned in the leaked documents had been dismissed or transferred to less significant positions. The Vatican Bank underwent a radical reorganization, during which thousands of questionable accounts were closed and international financial reporting standards were introduced. Vatileaks became a watershed moment in the history of the modern Catholic Church. The scandal forced the Vatican leadership to recognize the need for profound reforms and mark the beginning of a process of modernization of the Holy See's financial system that continues to this day. In October 2019, a scandal erupted in the quiet of the Vatican chambers that shook the foundations of the Holy See's financial system. At the center of events was Cardinal Becciu, one of the most influential prelates of the Curia, accused of embezzling 50 million euros in church funds to purchase luxury real estate in London's Chelsea district. The case became known as the London Palace Scandal and became a symbol of corruption in the upper echelons of the Catholic hierarchy. Becciu was born in 1948 in Sardinia to a simple peasant family. After being ordained a priest, he had a brilliant career in Vatican diplomacy, serving as nuncio in several countries, and in 2011, he was appointed Deputy Secretary of State of the Vatican. In 2018, Pope Francis elevated him to the rank of Cardinal, which was considered recognition of his outstanding service to the Church. The story of the scandalous deal began in 2014, when the Vatican Secretariat for the Economy, headed by Becciu, decided to invest church funds in prestigious London real estate. The investment target was a luxurious mansion at 60 Sloane Avenue in the heart of the respectable Chelsea district, where real estate prices are among the highest in the world. Formally, the deal looked like a sensible investment of church funds in a stable asset. London real estate has traditionally been considered a reliable investment, especially in an environment of low interest rates on bank deposits. Vatican financiers expected to receive a stable income from renting out the building and long-term capital gains from the rise in prices for luxury real estate. However, the details of the deal raised serious suspicions. The purchase was not made directly, but through a complex scheme involving the Luxembourg-registered investment fund, Athena Capital. The fund was managed by Raffaele Mincione, an Italian financier with a dubious reputation, and Gianluigi Torci, an entrepreneur whom the Italian press called a middleman in shady deals. Initially, the Vatican acquired only 45% of the building, paying 200 million euros for it. At the same time, the controlling stake remained with Athena Capital, which meant that the Church had no real control over the asset. This scheme contradicted the basic principles of investment policy and created risks for Vatican funds. The situation worsened when it became clear that the fund's managers were using the building not to generate rental income, but for speculative transactions. Some of the premises were converted into luxury apartments, which were sold at inflated prices. The profits from these transactions did not go to the Vatican, but to the accounts of private companies associated with Mincione and Torzi. The lawlessness reached its peak in 2018, when Torzi demanded an additional payment of 15 million euros from the Vatican for the transfer of full control of the building. In effect, this was an attempt at extortion. The Church was to pay extra for something that already belonged to it by right. Becciu, despite the objections of Vatican lawyers, authorized this payment. The scandal erupted after the new prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy, Cardinal George Pell, began auditing his department's financial transactions. The Australian Cardinal, known for his principled views on financial discipline, was shocked by the scale of the violations. His report to Pope Francis contained a detailed description of the abuses in the London real estate deal. The investigation revealed that Becciu not only authorized the questionable deal, but also received personal benefits from his cooperation with Italian intermediaries. Part of the funds were used to finance the charity Sogu International, headed by Cecilia Moroni, a close acquaintance of the Cardinal. This organization was formally engaged in helping refugees in Africa, but in fact, most of the funds were spent on administrative needs and personal expenses of the management. It was particularly scandalous when it was revealed that Moroni had used church funds to ransom hostages captured by terrorist groups in Mali and Burkina Faso. Although the liberation of people is a noble goal, financing terrorists is contrary to international law and the policies of most countries in the world. In September 2020, Pope Francis made the unprecedented decision to remove Becciu from all his positions and strip him of his cardinal privileges. This was the first time in modern history that a sitting cardinal had been publicly accused of corruption and demoted by decision of the Pope. The trial in the London Palace case began in July 2021 in a special Vatican tribunal. Becciu was accused of embezzlement, abuse of office, and fraud on a particularly large scale. 9 other individuals, including Mincioni, Torzi, and Moroni, were also on trial with him. The trial attracted unprecedented international media attention as the first trial of a cardinal on financial crimes in the modern history of the Catholic Church. The Vatican prosecutor demanded 7 years imprisonment for Becciu and compensation of 50 million euros. The cardinal's defense was based on the assertion that he had acted in good faith, relying on the advice of financial consultants, and had not personally benefited from the disputed transactions. However, the evidence presented showed that Becciu was aware of the risks and dubious nature of the deal, but continued to push it forward despite objections from his subordinates. In December 2023, Becciu was found guilty on most of the charges and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. The verdict was seen as evidence of Pope Francis's serious intentions to root out corruption in Vatican structures and restore confidence in the Church's financial system. The London Palace case had far-reaching consequences for the reform of Vatican finances. It demonstrated the need to strengthen control over major investment decisions and to create an effective system of checks and balances in financial management. The scandal also highlighted the importance of transparency and accountability, even for the most senior church hierarchs. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the international community radically changed its approach to combating terrorist financing. Banks around the world were forced to tighten procedures for monitoring suspicious transactions and reporting to regulators. Despite its special status, the Vatican Bank could not remain aloof from these processes, but it was precisely its closed nature and traditional secrecy that made it the subject of increased attention from the special services. The first suspicions of a possible link between Vatican financial structures and the financing of extremist organizations arose in 2003. The U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit, FinCEN, drew attention to unusual cash flows between the Vatican Bank and financial institutions in the Middle East. Of particular concern were large transfers to regions with active terrorist activity. The investigation revealed that a significant portion of these funds were sent to Catholic communities in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon under the guise of humanitarian aid. Formally, these transfers were completely legal. The Church had the right to support its believers in conflict regions. However, the lack of detailed control over the use of funds created the risk of them falling into the hands of terrorist groups. Transactions through Lebanese banks, some of which had ties to Hezbollah, an organization recognized as terrorist in many countries around the world, proved particularly problematic. The investigation established that some of the funds transferred by the Vatican Bank to support Lebanese Catholics could have been used to finance the military activities of this organization. The situation became more complicated after the publication in 2005 of the report of the Commission investigating the September 11th terrorist attacks. The document contained references to the use of religious organizations and charitable foundations to transfer funds to terrorist groups. Although the Vatican Bank was not directly mentioned, its status as the largest religious financial institution automatically made it a target of suspicion. Pressure on the Vatican intensified after a series of terrorist attacks in Europe in the mid-2000s. The special services of European countries began to study more closely the financial flows associated with religious organizations. The Vatican Bank was included in the list of institutions requiring special attention from financial monitoring authorities. A critical moment came in 2007. when the Italian financial police discovered a link between an account at the Vatican Bank and an al-Qaeda cell in Milan. The investigation revealed that the terrorists had received part of their funding through a chain of charitable organizations, one of which had an account with the Vatican Bank. Although no direct evidence was found that the bank was aware of the terrorist links, the incident seriously undermined its reputation. Transactions involving Islamic financial institutions were a particular cause for concern. As part of interfaith dialogue, the Vatican Bank developed relationships with banks in Muslim countries, which was a positive initiative in itself. However, some of these institutions were later suspected of financing extremist organizations. The most scandalous case was that of Al-Taqwa Bank in Switzerland, with which the Vatican Bank maintained correspondent relations. After the September 11th terrorist attacks, it became clear that this bank had financed the activities of al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. The connection with Al-Taqwa called into question the effectiveness of the Vatican Bank's control system. The U.S. authorities demanded that the Vatican provide detailed information on all transactions with suspicious financial institutions. This demand put the Holy See in a difficult position. On the one hand, it was necessary to demonstrate a willingness to cooperate in the fight against terrorism, and on the other, to preserve traditional banking secrecy and the autonomy of the FU Church. The turning point came in 2008, when the European Union included the Vatican Bank in the list of financial institutions requiring enhanced monitoring as part of the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. This decision meant that all of the bank's transactions with European partners were subject to additional scrutiny. In response to international pressure, the Vatican was forced to radically revise its financial transparency policy. In 2009, the creation of a special unit to combat terrorist financing was announced. This unit was given the authority to monitor all of the bank's transactions and to interact with international counterterrorism services. The new procedures provided for detailed verification of all bank customers and the purposes for which they used the funds. Transactions with organizations operating in regions of increased terrorist risk were subject to special control. A blacklist of individuals and legal entities with whom communication was strictly prohibited was created. The effectiveness of the new system was tested in 2011, when the Vatican Bank independently blocked an attempt to transfer a large sum to the accounts of an organization suspected of having links to terrorists. Information about this transaction was immediately forwarded to the relevant services, which made it possible to prevent the financing of terrorist activities. By 2015, the Vatican Bank had been removed from the list of high-risk institutions and received a positive assessment from international anti-terrorism organizations. However, the reputational costs of the allegations of terrorist financing were felt for a long time, and it took years of consistent work for the bank to regain the full trust of the international community. The experience of fighting allegations of terrorist financing has significantly changed the corporate culture of the Vatican Bank. A system of continuous risk monitoring was introduced, and Know Your Customer procedures and regular audits of all operations were established. These changes, although forced, ultimately contributed to raising the professional standards of the institution. The case of suspected terrorist financing was further proof that in today's world, no financial institution, even one with special religious status, can ignore international security requirements. The Vatican Bank was forced to find a balance between preserving its unique mission and complying with global counterterrorism standards. On March 13, 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio ascended to the papal throne, taking the name Francis. From the very beginning, the new pontiff made it clear that he intended to radically change the approach to managing Vatican finances. "I want a poor church for the poor," he said in one of his first interviews, and these words became the program for radical reforms that shook the foundations of the Holy See's financial system. Francis came to power in the midst of a deep crisis of confidence in the Vatican Bank. The Monsignor Scarano scandal had not yet subsided. International regulators were demanding complete transparency, and the Catholic public was outraged by the scale of corruption in church structures. The new pope had to not only make cosmetic changes, but also carry out a systemic transformation of the entire financial architecture of the Vatican. Just 1 month after his election, Francis created a special commission to study the economic and administrative structure of the Holy See. The commission was headed by 8 cardinals from different continents, symbolizing the global nature of the reforms. Particular attention was paid to attracting experts who were not associated with the former Vatican system and who had experience working in large international financial institutions. The first radical decision was to appoint Ernst von Freiberg, a German aristocrat and experienced banker known for his impeccable reputation, as president of the Vatican Bank. Von Freiberg was given unprecedented powers to reorganize the institution, including the right to close accounts without consulting the former management. Under his leadership, the most extensive audit in the bank's history was conducted. The international consulting firm Promontory Financial Group was given access to all of the institution's documents and transactions for the past 15 years. The results of the audit shocked even experienced specialists. Thousands of accounts with unidentified beneficiaries, fictitious transactions worth billions of euros, and systematic violations of international banking supervision standards were uncovered. The Great Purge began in July 2013. In the first 6 months, more than 3,000 accounts were closed because their owners were unable to provide documentary evidence of the legal origin of the funds. This operation affected many influential clients, including representatives of the Italian political elite, major businessmen, and even some high-ranking church hierarchs. At the same time, Pope Francis initiated the creation of a fundamentally new structure for managing Vatican finances. In February 2014, the Secretariat for the Economy was established, which was given the authority to coordinate all financial activities of the Holy See. Cardinal George Pell, an Australian prelate with a reputation as a tough reformer, headed the new structure. Pell immediately began taking inventory of all Vatican assets, many of which had been outside centralized accounting for decades. The results of this work were sensational. The total value of real estate owned by various Vatican structures exceeded 5 billion euros, which is several times more than the officially reported figures. A revolutionary innovation was the publication of the first consolidated financial report of the Holy See in history. The 100-page document contained detailed information on the income, expenses, and assets of all Vatican structures. For the first time, the public had the opportunity to see the real scale of church finances and how they were used. Pope Francis paid particular attention to the ethical aspects of investment policy. A special commission on ethical investments was created, which developed strict criteria for selecting objects for investment of church funds. Investments in the arms industry, tobacco companies, enterprises that use child labor, and firms whose activities contradict the social teachings of the Church were banned. Radical changes also affected personnel policy. Many Vatican Bank employees who had worked at the institution for decades were retired or transferred to other positions. They were replaced by young professionals with international experience working in leading banks around the world. English became the working language of the bank alongside Italian, symbolizing its integration into the global financial system. Changes in the institution's corporate culture were no less important. A system of regular reporting and internal control was introduced. Procedures for anonymous reporting of violations were created, and strict codes of ethics were introduced for all employees. The traditional atmosphere of secrecy and mutual responsibility was replaced by a culture of transparency and accountability. The results of the reforms were not long in coming. Already in 2015, the Vatican Bank received a positive assessment from the Moneyval Committee and was removed from all international blacklists. Leading rating agencies raised the institution's credit rating, and the world's largest banks resumed correspondent relations with it. Financial indicators also demonstrated the effectiveness of the changes. Despite the closure of thousands of questionable accounts, the bank's overall profitability increased thanks to improved asset quality and reduced reputational risks. The average return on investment increased from 3 to 7% per annum, while portfolio volatility decreased. However, the reforms also met with serious resistance within the Vatican structures. Many representatives of the old guard considered the changes a betrayal of church traditions and a capitulation to secular authorities. This confrontation reached its peak in the case of Cardinal Becciu, which showed that the struggle between supporters and opponents of the reforms was far from over. By the end of the first decade of Francis's pontificate, it had become clear that the Vatican Bank had been transformed into a fundamentally different institution. From a closed structure shrouded in secrecy and scandal, it had gradually transformed into a modern financial institution that meets international standards of transparency and ethics. Pope Francis's revolution in church finances has been one of the most significant achievements of his pontificate. It has demonstrated that even the most conservative institutions are capable of radical change when the challenges of the times and the expectations of the faithful demand it. However, the transformation process is far from complete, and future generations of church leaders will face the need to maintain the standards achieved and respond to new challenges in a globalized world. By the end of 2013, the Great Purge of the Vatican Bank had entered its most active phase. What began as a routine audit of accounts turned into a large-scale operation to cleanse the institution of dubious clients and criminal connections. During the first 18 months of Pope Francis's pontificate, more than 6,000 accounts were closed, almost half of the total number. This unprecedented step became a symbol of the new leadership's determination to put an end to the Vatican Bank's dark past. The account closure procedures were developed by international consultants, taking into account best global practices. Each client received an official notification requesting documents confirming the legality of the origin of the funds and the compliance of their activities with the mission of the Catholic Church. Those who were unable or unwilling to provide the necessary information were automatically excluded from the bank's client base. Particular attention was paid to accounts with large balances and active transactions. Among those closed were the accounts of several Italian politicians, including former ministers and members of parliament. The bank also severed ties with a number of entrepreneurs suspected of links to organized crime and representatives of Latin American elites, whose capital origins raised questions. The closure of accounts linked to Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya received international attention. An investigation revealed that funds belonging to the entourage of the ousted dictator had passed through the Vatican Bank. Although these transactions did not formally violate the law at the time they were carried out, the bank's new management considered them incompatible with the ethical principles of the Church. The closure of the accounts of some high-ranking prelates was painful for the Vatican elite. Among them were 3 bishops and 1 cardinal, who were unable to explain the sources of significant sums in their personal accounts. These cases demonstrated that the new policy makes no exceptions, even for representatives of the church hierarchy. Technically, the operation was carried out using the most advanced data analysis systems. Bank specialists implemented machine learning algorithms to identify suspicious patterns in financial transactions. Each transaction was analyzed according to several dozen parameters, including the geography of transfers, the frequency of transactions, connections with other clients, and compliance with the stated purposes for which the funds were to be used. A special category was made up of so-called dormant accounts, deposits that had not seen any movement of funds for many years. Many of them belonged to individuals who had died decades ago, or to organizations that had long since ceased to exist. The total amount of funds in such accounts exceeded 200 million euros. After complying with all legal procedures, this money was transferred to a special fund to finance the church's charitable projects. The most difficult task was working with offshore structures. Many of the bank's clients did not own accounts directly, but through complex schemes involving companies registered in offshore jurisdictions. The new management demanded full disclosure of the ownership structure and ultimate beneficiaries of all corporate accounts. Those clients who refused to provide such information were automatically closed. The geopolitical aspect of the cleanup manifested itself in the bank's work with clients from countries under international sanctions. The Vatican Bank decided to completely cease servicing individuals and legal entities from Iran, North Korea, and a number of other countries, regardless of their ties to the Church. This decision sparked protests from some Catholic communities, but the management considered it necessary to maintain the institution's reputation. The account closure operation was accompanied by a large-scale modernization of the bank's IT infrastructure. Outdated accounting systems, some of which had been in use since the 1970s, were replaced with modern software packages that met international banking technology standards. The new system ensured complete transparency of operations and the ability to track them in real time. Personnel changes affected all levels of the bank's management. More than half of the old employees were dismissed and replaced by specialists from leading international banks. Particular attention was paid to hiring experts in compliance and risk management, professions that had previously been virtually non-existent at the Vatican Bank. The client policy was radically revised. New admission rules limited the circle of potential clients exclusively to church structures, religious orders, and individuals directly related to the activities of the Catholic Church. Corporate services were virtually discontinued, with the exception of companies wholly owned by church organizations. The financial consequences of the Great Purge were mixed. On the one hand, the bank lost a significant portion of its deposit base, with total customer funds declining by approximately 40%. On the other hand, operational and reputational risks decreased sharply, allowing the bank to access cheaper funding on international markets. International recognition of the results of the reforms came in 2015, when the European Central Bank included the Vatican Bank in the list of institutions that meet all the requirements of European banking supervision. This decision opened up opportunities for the Vatican institution to participate directly in the European SEPA payment system without additional intermediary banks. The symbolic conclusion of the Great Purge was the ceremony of burning closed account documents in December 2015. In the presence of international auditors and representatives of the press, tons of paper archives containing information about dubious transactions of the past decades were destroyed. This ritual symbolized a final break with the institution's dark past. By the end of the operation, the Vatican Bank had been transformed into a fundamentally different institution. From a closed structure serving dubious clients, it became an exemplary religious bank that meets the most stringent international standards. The Great Purge demonstrated that even the most conservative and closed institutions are capable of radical transformation when there is political will and professional leadership. However, the cleansing process did not come without costs. Many Catholic organizations in developing countries were left without their usual banking services, which created certain difficulties in their work. Some critics accused the bank's management of excessive radicalism and bowing to external pressure. Nevertheless, most experts recognize the Great Purge as a necessary and successful step in the modernization of Vatican finances. By the mid-2000s, the Vatican Bank found itself at the center of unprecedented international pressure. Financial regulators from the world's leading countries, coordinating their actions through international organizations, demanded that the Holy See fully comply with global banking supervision standards. For the first time in history, a sovereign city-state was forced to submit to external control over its financial system. A key role in this process was played by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, an international organization that sets standards for combating the legalization of proceeds from criminal activity. In 2013, the FATF included the Vatican among the jurisdictions requiring enhanced monitoring, which effectively meant international financial isolation. The pressure intensified after the US FBI published a report on the role of religious organizations in money laundering schemes. Although the Vatican Bank was not directly mentioned in the document, its findings created an extremely unfavorable context for the institution's activities. The U.S. authorities made it clear that they were prepared to apply the same sanctions to the Vatican Bank as to other problematic financial institutions. European Union regulators took a particularly harsh stance. The European Banking Authority required all EU banks to terminate correspondent relationships with institutions that did not meet European transparency standards. Since the Vatican Bank depended on European correspondents to conduct international transactions, this threat could completely paralyze its activities. The critical moment came in January 2014, when Deutsche Bank decided to stop servicing the Vatican Bank's accounts. The German bank, traditionally loyal to the Catholic Church, explained its decision by saying that it could not guarantee that the Vatican institution's operations complied with German anti-money laundering legislation. The chain reaction was not long in coming. Within a few months, the Vatican Bank lost its correspondent relationships with Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas, and a number of other major European banks. The institution found itself on the verge of complete isolation from the international banking system, which threatened to collapse its operations. The international community was particularly concerned about the bank's links with jurisdictions traditionally used to hide assets. Regulators demanded full disclosure of all transactions with banks in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and other countries with banking secrecy laws. These requirements affected the interests of many influential clients of the institution. The U.S. Treasury went even further, requiring the Vatican Bank to comply with the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, which required foreign banks to provide information on the accounts of U.S. citizens. This requirement was particularly painful, as the bank's clients included many American Catholics who counted on the confidentiality of their financial transactions. The turning point came when the International Monetary Fund decided to include the Vatican Bank on its list of institutions posing a systemic risk to global financial stability. Although the bank was relatively small by international standards, its connections with many Catholic organizations around the world created the potential for contagion throughout the entire church financial system. Under pressure from circumstances, Pope Francis was forced to make unprecedented concessions to the international community. In April 2014, the Holy See signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, committing itself to comply with all international standards for the automatic exchange of tax information. This decision sparked fierce protests among Vatican conservatives, who considered it a capitulation to secular authorities. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, publicly stated that the Church should not submit to the dictates of bankers and bureaucrats. However, Pope Francis insisted on the need for reforms to preserve the moral authority of the Church. The practical implementation of international requirements necessitated a radical restructuring of the entire banking system. A special international compliance department was created, staffed by specialists from the world's leading banks. The new department was given the authority to block any transactions that did not comply with international standards. The implementation of requirements to combat terrorist financing proved particularly difficult. The bank was forced to create its own financial intelligence service, which compared customer and transaction data with international blacklists in real time. Any match automatically led to the blocking of the transaction and notification of the relevant services. A revolutionary innovation was the introduction of a fully digital reporting system. The Vatican Bank became the first financial institution in the world to provide regulators with online access to databases of all transactions. A special secure system allowed authorized bodies to track the movement of funds in real time and identify suspicious transactions. International pressure reached its peak with the demand that the Vatican ratify the UN Convention against Corruption. For a long time, the Holy See avoided ratifying this document, citing the peculiarities of canon law. However, the threat of complete international isolation forced the Vatican authorities to reconsider their position. By the end of 2015, the Vatican Bank had successfully passed all international audits and was removed from the list of problematic institutions. However, the price of this success was extremely high. The institution effectively lost its financial autonomy and became a structure completely controlled by the international community. The symbolic end of the era of pressure came in December 2015, with the signing of an agreement to join the Common Reporting Standard developed by the OECD. This agreement obliged the Vatican Bank to automatically transfer information about the accounts of foreign residents to the tax authorities of their countries. In effect, this meant the end of banking secrecy, which had been the foundation of the institution's activities for centuries. The requirement to disclose information about so-called politically exposed persons was particularly painful. The bank was forced to create a special database of high-ranking officials, politicians, and their relatives from around the world. Any transactions involving such persons were subject to mandatory notification to the relevant regulatory authorities. The technological transformation of the bank under pressure from international requirements was unprecedented. The institution spent more than 100 million euros on the implementation of the most modern monitoring and control systems. Each transaction was analyzed by a multitude of algorithms in real time, and suspicious transactions were automatically blocked until all circumstances were clarified. International pressure also led to radical changes in the bank's personnel policy. The new requirements stipulated that key positions could only be held by individuals who had been approved by international regulatory authorities. In effect, this meant that appointments at the Vatican Bank were controlled not only by church authorities, but also by secular regulators. The result of all these changes was a complete transformation of the very essence of the Vatican Bank. From a closed institution serving the interests of the church elite, it became a model bank that met the most stringent international standards. However, this transformation called into question the very need for a special church bank, as its functions now differed little from those of ordinary commercial banks. International pressure has had a long-term impact on relations between the Vatican and the international community. For the first time in history, a sovereign state was forced to completely subordinate its financial system to external control. This set a precedent that could be used against other small states and special jurisdictions. The Vatican Bank's influence on the global economy and politics during its 8 decades of existence has been much more significant than its relatively modest size would suggest. As a financial institution of a sovereign state with a unique international status, the bank has become an important tool not only for church policy, but also for the geopolitical games of the world's major powers. During the Cold War, the Vatican Bank played a special role in financing anti-communist movements around the world. Funds intended to support Catholic organizations in socialist countries, as well as opposition movements in Latin America, passed through its accounts. These schemes were particularly active in Poland to support the Solidarity Trade Union and other anti-communist forces. According to declassified documents, American intelligence agencies viewed the Vatican Bank as an important channel for covertly financing their operations in regions where direct intervention was impossible. The CIA used the bank's connections with Catholic missions to conduct operations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, disguising political activities as religious and charitable. The bank's influence on political processes in Italy was particularly significant. Funds passed through its accounts to support the Christian Democratic Party and other anti-communist political forces. These operations were carried out in close coordination with the U.S. authorities, who saw the Catholic Church as an important ally in the fight against the spread of communism in Western Europe. The bank also played an important role in economic relations between developed and developing countries. Through its structures, large investments were made in the economies of Latin American countries, which made it possible to circumvent various restrictions and sanctions. Many transnational corporations used their connections with the bank to conduct operations in regions with unstable political situations. Scandals involving the Vatican Bank have repeatedly affected international financial markets. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano in 1982 led to a serious crisis of confidence in the Italian banking system and required the intervention of the Italian Central Bank to prevent a wider collapse. The bank's links to organized crime have affected the effectiveness of international efforts to combat money laundering. The use of Vatican structures by Mafia groups to launder criminal proceeds has forced the international community to rethink its approach to regulating religious financial institutions. In the field of international law, the Vatican Bank's activities have created numerous precedents concerning the relationship between religious freedom and financial regulation requirements. Disputes over the applicability of secular law to religious institutions continue to influence the development of international financial law. The Vatican scandals had a particularly significant impact on the development of international cooperation in the fight against financial crime. The need to control the bank's activities was one of the factors that stimulated the creation of international organizations to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. The geopolitical influence of the bank was manifested in its role as a mediator in the settlement of international conflicts. In a number of cases, Vatican financial channels were used to conduct secret negotiations between conflicting parties when official diplomacy was blocked. The institution's economic influence extended far beyond the financial sector. The bank's investment policy influenced the development of entire sectors of the economy, especially in real estate and the media. Control over large media companies allowed the Church to influence public opinion on key issues. Its influence on global currency markets was manifested through the bank's large currency transactions, which were sometimes used to stabilize national currencies during periods of crisis. Such operations were particularly active in relation to the currencies of Catholic countries in Latin America. The bank played a pioneering role in the development of offshore banking. Many of the schemes and mechanisms first developed at the Vatican institution were later replicated by other offshore jurisdictions around the world. This indirect influence on the development of the international financial architecture cannot be overestimated. The Vatican Bank's recent reforms have had a significant impact on the entire system of regulation of religious financial institutions. The standards of transparency and accountability introduced at the Vatican Bank have become a model for similar organizations of other faiths around the world. The impact on the development of financial technologies was evident in the fact that the need to monitor the bank's operations stimulated the creation of new systems for the automatic analysis of suspicious transactions. Many of these technologies were later implemented in commercial banks. The social impact of the scandals surrounding the bank on the Catholic Church was enormous. The loss of trust in the Church's financial activities among the faithful became one of the factors in the general crisis of authority of religious institutions in the modern world. This forced the Church leadership to rethink many traditional approaches to management and communication with the congregation. By the early 2020s, the Vatican Bank, having undergone a radical transformation, had become a symbol of the possibility of profound reform even in the most conservative institutions. Its experience is being closely studied by economists, political scientists, and international law experts as a unique case of forcing transparency on a structure that traditionally operated in complete secrecy. The Vatican Bank's influence on the global economy and politics continues to be felt today, although the nature of that influence has changed dramatically. From an instrument of covert influence, it has become a model of transparency, demonstrating the international community's ability to compel even sovereign states with special status to comply with global standards.